3 days, 3 long, agonizing days I spent sitting in an empty house. Watching the shadows stretch across the walls, my son had just sold without a word. What would you do if the people you trusted most turned their backs on you, leaving you alone in the life you thought was yours? This is the story of betrayal, heartbreak, and eventually, the quiet strength that helped me reclaim my life. Stay with me as I share a true story about this grandma. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that touch the heart and soul. After I gave him everything, my son sold the house I was living in. I still remember that night as if the darkness itself had left a permanent mark on my memory. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old floorboards settling under their own weight. I sat in the living room, a small lamp casting a soft glow, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly felt unfamiliar. The air was heavy with anticipation, or maybe it was fear. I could never quite tell the difference in those moments. For years, I had believed that love and duty would be enough to keep a family intact. I had given everything: time, energy, endless patience. I had believed that sacrifices would be remembered, that devotion could shield those I cared for from the storms of life. But that night, I realized how fragile those beliefs truly were. One phone call, one unexpected knock, one moment of silence had the power to fracture what I had spent decades building. The children were asleep upstairs, their steady breathing a small comfort against the uncertainty pressing against the walls. I thought of them constantly, how every choice I made was measured against their safety and happiness. The weight of responsibility is a peculiar thing. It presses down silently, shaping every thought, every gesture, every decision, until you hardly notice the strain on your own heart. And yet, even under that weight, there was a glimmer of hope, faint but persistent, that we could endure whatever came next. I looked around the room, noticing details I had taken for granted. The faded curtains, a little torn at the hem, the bookshelf sagging under the weight of novels, photo albums, and keepsakes. The sofa, worn but comfortable, bearing the impressions of years of laughter, tears, and small victories. Every item carried a story, a memory, a fragment of life that felt impossibly precious now that the future had begun to feel uncertain. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and I imagined it whispering warnings. There had been whispers before, small signs that something was amiss, moments brushed aside in the name of normalcy. But that night I could no longer ignore them. Fear had a sharper edge than it ever had before, an unmistakable clarity that demanded action. I had to prepare, to anticipate, to protect, because sometimes love alone is not enough. I reflected on the years that had led to this point. We had once lived in a home full of warmth, laughter, and the comforting certainty of routine. Even on the darkest days, there had been small moments of joy. Children chasing each other through the yard, the smell of baked bread on a Sunday morning, quiet conversations by the fire. Those memories were treasures now, fragile and fleeting. Reminders of a life that could never fully return. In the stillness, I found myself sifting through choices, wondering where I had gone wrong or whether the fault was ever truly mine. It is a strange, isolating experience to question every decision you have made in the light of a sudden rupture. Every sacrifice, every compromise, every ounce of patience feels both vital and futile at once. I had tried to anticipate problems, to foresee consequences, to manage the delicate balance of love, obedience, and survival. And yet, even the best-laid plans sometimes collapse when the ground beneath you shifts without warning. I allowed myself to think of what was at stake: the children, their innocence, the fragile sense of safety that I had fought so hard to preserve. My mind traced the years of devotion, the sleepless nights, the countless moments of quiet endurance, all culminating in this one instant of uncertainty. It was dizzying to realize how much of life's outcome rests not in grand gestures, but in the small, invisible threads we weave every day. And when those threads snap, the consequences ripple outward, touching everything in their path. As I sat there, a faint sound from the hallway made me startle. It was a reminder that life moves on regardless of our fears. The world outside is indifferent to the dramas that unfold behind closed doors. Yet within those walls, every heartbeat, every sigh, every whispered reassurance carries immense weight. I found myself listening more closely than ever, attuning to the small rhythms of the house, the ticking clock, the hum of the heater, the occasional creak from the attic above. Despite the tension, there was a strange clarity in that moment. The stillness demanded attention, reflection, and preparation. It was a liminal space, a pause before the storm, where everything seemed both fragile and urgent. I understood with a certainty that was almost painful that nothing could remain as it was. Change was coming, unavoidable and immense, and I had to meet it with every ounce of courage I could summon. The room felt impossibly large, the shadows deeper than usual, as though the darkness itself was pressing against the light. I focused on small details to anchor myself. The patterned rug beneath my feet, the worn leather of the armchair, the faint aroma of the tea I had poured hours before. Those fragments of normalcy became a lifeline, a reminder that even in upheaval, life carries on and endurance is possible. And then, as if the house had been holding its breath along with me, a distant noise stirred, an echo from the past or a harbinger of the future I could not say. It was a subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, yet it resonated through the floorboards and into my chest. In that vibration, I felt both fear and determination. The journey ahead would not be easy. It would demand resilience, patience, and an unwavering commitment to what mattered most. And in that quiet, heavy night, I understood that this was only the beginning. The first step had been taken, though I did not yet know where it would lead. All I knew was that survival for my children and for myself required alertness, courage, and the willingness to face an uncertain future without faltering. The room remained silent, the shadows unmoving, yet within me a fire had begun to flicker, a fire that would carry me through the trials to come. Because sometimes it is in the quietest moments, when the world seems most still, that the heart recognizes the first tremors of change. And in those tremors we find both fear and the raw strength to endure. Morning light filtered through the blinds, sharp and almost accusing, cutting through the haze of worry that had settled overnight. The children were already awake, their small voices echoing through the narrow apartment. I moved quietly, not because I feared waking them, but because the ritual of routine grounded me. It was a way to impose order on a life that had begun to feel unmoored. Breakfast was simple, the clatter of spoons and plates filling the silence that hung heavier than the night before. Outside, the city hummed to life, indifferent to the upheavals inside this tiny home. I watched the children eat, noticing their mannerisms, the careful way Daniel buttered his toast, Lucy tracing patterns in her cereal, Thomas Jr. poking at his eggs with tentative curiosity. Small gestures, small moments, yet each one carried immense significance. They were evidence that life continued, fragile as it might be. After they left for school, I stood by the window, peering out at a street that felt both familiar and alien. The neighbors went about their routines, cars moving in predictable rhythms, people waving without real awareness of the private storms happening behind each door. I envied that simplicity, the ability to live unaware while I navigated the aftermath of sudden loss and betrayal. The apartment, cramped and modest, seemed to close in on me, each corner a reminder of what had been taken away. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, arranging the living space to feel like home. A vase of fresh flowers on the table, the worn rug straightened, photos of happier times taped to the wall, yet the effort felt hollow at times. The absence of our old home, the place where laughter had once echoed freely, was a void I could not fill. And still I moved forward, propelled by instinct and duty. Loneliness became a constant companion. Friends reached out occasionally, their concern genuine but limited by distance and their own lives. Some offered advice, others sympathy, but few could understand the depth of displacement, the subtle terror that lingered in every quiet moment. The world expects resilience, expects composure, even when the foundation beneath you has cracked. And so I learned to wear a mask, projecting strength while silently counting the hours until bedtime, when the world felt safest and the children were at rest. I began to notice small changes in myself. Mornings were still met with resolve, but fatigue crept in faster than it once had. My mind, always alert, sometimes faltered, clouded by worry or exhaustion. Nights were longer, filled with the quiet contemplation of what had been lost and what might come next. I started keeping lists, tasks to accomplish, calls to make, errands to run, but these were more than organizational tools. They were anchors, a way to tether myself to purpose amidst uncertainty. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when the weight lifted slightly. A note from a teacher praising Daniel's progress, a drawing Lucy had done pinned to the fridge, Thomas Jr., laughing at something utterly ordinary yet completely wonderful. These fragments of joy reminded me that even in hardship, life offered small proofs of persistence and beauty. They were reminders that the children's world, while altered, was not devoid of hope. I also found solace in routine walks around the neighborhood. The city streets, lined with familiar shops and trees just beginning to bud with spring, offered a sense of continuity. I would breathe deeply, noticing the sound of my own footsteps, the smell of freshly cut grass, the distant laughter of children playing in parks. These walks were not escapes but reminders that life persisted, that beauty and danger often coexist, and that moving forward required a keen awareness of both. Financial pressures were ever present. Bills arrived with punctuality that was both relentless and cruel. I managed accounts carefully, tracking expenses, making sacrifices in ways that felt almost invisible. Nights were sometimes spent poring over paperwork, ensuring that every dollar stretched as far as possible. It was exhausting but necessary. The house, the family's past life might be gone, but survival demanded vigilance, and I was determined not to falter. There were occasional reminders of betrayal, moments when the past pressed against the present. I would pass a street or hear a name that summoned the memory of the home we had lost, the choices made by others that had caused our displacement. These memories were painful, yet they also carried lessons. I began to understand that resilience is not born in comfort but in adversity. Each day of careful survival, each small triumph over circumstance became a quiet testament to endurance. The children, despite everything, were adapting. Daniel displayed a quiet maturity that both comforted and worried me. He was protective of his siblings, often sensing emotions that they themselves could not articulate. Lucy's creativity flourished in unexpected ways: drawings, small stories, bits of music she invented to fill the silence. Thomas Jr., with his gentle curiosity, began exploring the world beyond the apartment, finding wonder in ordinary moments. Observing them, I realized that life's continuity does not depend solely on material security, but on the preservation of love, stability, and care. Even in the midst of challenges, I discovered inner resources I had never consciously acknowledged. Patience deepened into a quiet strength, fear transformed into caution and preparation, and sorrow became tempered with purpose. The process of rebuilding a life, no matter how modest, demanded constant awareness, creativity, and an unyielding commitment to those I loved. And although the past remained a shadow, it also offered insight into the resilience necessary for the years ahead. By evening, the apartment took on a softer light. The children returned, their presence filling the space with energy and laughter, fragile though it might be. Homework was completed. Meals were shared, stories told. The familiar rhythm of family life, however altered, brought comfort. In those moments, I understood that survival is not merely about enduring hardship. It is about creating pockets of normalcy, small islands of peace in a sea of uncertainty. And as night fell, I would sit quietly, reflecting on the day's trials and victories. The first fracture of our lives had set the stage for everything that followed. Each day was a choice: to give in to despair or to carry on with deliberate, measured determination. I chose the latter, understanding that love, persistence, and careful attention could forge a life in the shadow of loss. Sometimes I imagined the home we had lost, the laughter that once filled its rooms. And sometimes I allowed myself a brief, private acknowledgement of grief. But even in that grief there was resolve, the knowledge that what mattered most was the well-being of the children, the continuity of care, and the quiet, unwavering assertion that we would endure. The days blended into one another, yet each brought new lessons, new challenges, and small triumphs that carried us forward. In the quiet moments I felt both sorrow and strength, a duality that defined this new chapter of life. And even as the uncertainty loomed, I realized that we were not defeated. We were learning, adapting, surviving, preparing unknowingly for the transformations yet to come. Family had always been the center of life, the axis around which everything else spun. Even in the most difficult years, the memory of shared meals, laughter echoing through the hallways, and the quiet reassurance of togetherness remained a lifeline. Yet looking back, it was clear that the foundation of love had never been entirely immune to strain. Each bond carried its own history of joy and tension, and the way those dynamics evolved would shape everything that came next. The children's father had been a quiet man, a man whose love was often expressed through practical gestures rather than words. When he was present, there was a calm certainty that grounded the household. But his absence or misjudgment could leave a cavernous void. Over time, the house had become a patchwork of routines and compromises, small battles won and lost behind closed doors. I had learned early on that family life demanded both patience and vigilance, a balancing act that never truly ended. Grandparents, aunts, and uncles had once been part of the tapestry, their visits infusing ordinary days with stories, advice, and occasional indulgences. Birthdays were celebrated with enthusiasm, holidays filled with laughter and food that seemed to carry warmth far beyond the kitchen. Those moments lingered in memory like snapshots of light in otherwise ordinary days, vivid reminders that love had been abundant, even when challenges loomed on the horizon. But family was not without its complications. Sibling rivalries, differing priorities, and small disappointments had always existed, quietly shaping the way relationships unfolded. Over the years, it became apparent that love alone could not shield anyone from misunderstandings, nor could it erase the impact of decisions made in haste or out of fear. Even within the closest families, tensions could accumulate, sometimes unnoticed until the weight became impossible to ignore. The children were witnesses to all of it, absorbing lessons from both action and inaction. They saw the quiet sacrifices, the unspoken disappointments, the tensions that arose when priorities conflicted. Yet they also saw resilience, the way care and attention could counterbalance mistakes, the way love could endure even when circumstances threatened to fracture it. Every interaction, every shared meal, every bedtime story carried the dual role of teaching and comforting. I often reflected on the delicate balance between protection and independence. Children require guidance, but they also need space to grow, to stumble, and to learn from experience. The challenge was to provide both safety and opportunity, a paradox that demanded constant adjustment. In those early years after upheaval, the task became even more urgent. The loss of stability, the betrayal of trust, and the sudden displacement required an approach that was both firm and gentle, navigating fear and curiosity in equal measure. Family, in this context, was both literal and symbolic. It represented not only the people under one roof but also the ideals that sustain relationships: loyalty, empathy, patience, and understanding. These were the principles I clung to even when circumstances seemed designed to test them. They guided decisions, informed responses, and offered a framework for maintaining a sense of cohesion when the external world felt unpredictable. There were moments of unexpected tenderness that reminded me why all the effort was worthwhile. A spontaneous hug, a shared joke, the way the children would help one another without prompting. These instances illuminated the enduring strength of family bonds. Even in the shadow of betrayal and loss, the capacity for love and connection remained, fragile yet undeniable, offering proof that the past could not entirely dictate the present. Yet the past was never far away. Decisions made years earlier, patterns established long before the upheaval, continued to influence every interaction. Misunderstandings and unresolved tensions surfaced in subtle ways, manifesting in arguments, silent treatments, or expressions of frustration. I had to navigate these carefully, often mediating between instinctive reactions and the desire to preserve peace. The weight of responsibility was constant, a reminder that the stability of the household rested on attention, patience, and careful judgment. Through it all, the children became mirrors, reflecting not only their own emotions but also the impact of my responses. Their reactions revealed the effectiveness of my guidance, the limits of my patience, and the consequences of my choices. Watching them grow, I understood that parenting was less about control and more about presence, less about dictating outcomes than offering a steady anchor in turbulent waters. Every bedtime conversation, every correction, every word of encouragement carried significance far beyond the immediate moment. Extended family remained a mixed presence, supportive at times, complicated at others. Visits from relatives could bring comfort or tension, depending on unspoken expectations and lingering disagreements. Holidays became exercises in negotiation, balancing individual needs with collective tradition. Even in these situations, the children learned lessons about compromise, empathy, and the resilience required to maintain relationships that are meaningful yet imperfect. I also discovered the importance of memory in sustaining family identity. Photographs, letters, keepsakes, and stories became tools for continuity, helping the children understand where they came from and how their lives were shaped. These tangible reminders offered context, grounding them in a sense of belonging that could survive the temporary chaos of our daily existence. Every old photograph, every story repeated at the dinner table, served as both anchor and lesson, preserving a connection to a past that remained instructive despite its imperfections. Despite the effort to maintain stability, cracks were inevitable. Children are sensitive to subtleties, noticing inconsistencies or emotional tension that adults may overlook. I had to be vigilant, attentive, and occasionally strategic to prevent minor disruptions from escalating into lasting rifts. The goal was not perfection, impossible in any family, but rather continuity, love, and a commitment to endure together. Through it all, I realized that family is not static. It evolves, adapts, and survives because of both shared history and daily effort. The bonds formed through years of care, sacrifice, and attention do not dissolve easily, even when external forces threaten. And in that realization there was solace, a reminder that the foundation, though tested, remained strong enough to weather storms yet to come. The past was a teacher, the present a challenge, and the future an uncertain canvas. Yet through it all, the enduring truth was clear. Family, in its many forms and despite its imperfections, was the compass guiding every choice, every action, and every moment of endurance. It was the anchor that kept the heart tethered, the light that illuminated dark corridors, and the reason to keep moving forward even when hope felt tenuous. The morning it all changed began quietly, almost deceptively so. The sun rose pale and weak behind a layer of clouds, casting a gray light across the street. At first it seemed like any other day. The children bustling around with backpacks, the faint smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of daily life pressing on. But beneath that ordinary surface, something had shifted, a subtle tension I could feel but could not yet name. I was reviewing bills at the kitchen table, stacking envelopes with careful hands, when a phone call came that would unravel everything. The voice on the other end was calm, almost clinical, yet the words cut through the quiet like a knife. It was brief, just enough to convey a fact that should have seemed impossible. The house, the place I had called home, the space where memories lingered in every corner, was no longer ours. It had been sold. At first I thought it must be a mistake. Surely there had been some misunderstanding, some bureaucratic error that could be corrected. But as the details unfolded, names, dates, documents, I realized that the finality of the action could not be reversed. In that instant, the world as I knew it contracted, and a deep, hollow ache settled in my chest. The floor beneath me felt less steady, and the familiar walls, once a sanctuary, now seemed distant and unreachable. Memories of that house came rushing back with painful clarity. The hallway where the children's laughter had once echoed, the kitchen where meals were prepared with care, the living room sofa that bore the marks of countless evenings spent reading stories and watching movies, all of it felt impossibly far away. I could almost hear the faint echoes of past birthdays, the murmur of quiet conversations, the rhythm of footsteps on familiar floors. And yet the reality was undeniable. It was gone, replaced by documents, signatures, and transactions that left no room for sentiment. The betrayal was not abstract. It was specific, personal, and searing. To realize that someone I had trusted implicitly could make such a decision without consultation or warning was devastating. The house had been more than a structure. It had been a repository of dreams, a physical testament to years of labor, love, and devotion. Losing it felt like losing a part of myself, a tangible representation of effort and care rendered meaningless in a single, irreversible act. I moved slowly, almost mechanically, through the rest of the morning. The children were unaware, playing in the living room, their voices a fragile shield against the encroaching reality. I wondered how to tell them, how to explain that the place that had nurtured them, where they had grown and learned, no longer belonged to us. The thought of shattering that sense of security filled me with dread, yet I knew avoidance was not an option. The truth, as cruel as it might be, would eventually surface. Outside, the world continued its indifferent course. Neighbors passed by, cars rumbled over familiar streets, the city went about its business as if nothing had changed. It was a reminder of how isolated personal tragedy can feel, how quickly the larger world moves on while the heart struggles to catch up. The contrast between the relentless normalcy outside and the upheaval within was almost unbearable. As the hours passed, the reality crystallized further. The house had been sold to someone else, someone who would not understand the history embedded in its walls, the small, intimate details that made it ours. The knowledge carried a bitter sting, not merely because of the material loss, but because it signified a rupture in trust, an alteration of the familial landscape that could not be undone. I found myself retracing every interaction, every decision, wondering when the shift had begun. Were there signs I had missed, moments of subtle discontent, quiet discussions held in hushed tones? The mind becomes a relentless investigator in moments like these, searching for explanations, seeking patterns that might offer solace. Yet often there are no clear answers, only fragments and shadows that illuminate the depth of what has been lost. The children noticed a change in me. My movements were slower, my tone sharper, my expressions tinged with tension. They asked questions, small ones at first, innocuous inquiries about plans and schedules, but even these were colored by uncertainty. I offered reassurances, careful and measured, shielding them from the full weight of what had happened. Yet even in my attempts to protect, I could not fully conceal the tremor of fear, anger, and disbelief that ran beneath every gesture. By evening the house felt emptier than ever, though physically unchanged. The walls, the furniture, the familiar arrangement of objects, all remained the same. Yet the sense of belonging had shifted irrevocably. I realized that home is not defined solely by space, but by security, history, and trust. And when those elements are stripped away, the physical surroundings become hollow shells, echoes of a life once lived rather than a place of refuge. The quiet moments that followed were filled with reflection. I thought of all the sacrifices made to maintain stability, the countless hours spent working, organizing, nurturing, the emotional energy devoted to maintaining relationships and ensuring the children's sense of normalcy. Each effort, once a source of pride and reassurance, now felt vulnerable to the unpredictable choices of others. It was a painful lesson in the limits of control, in the fragile nature of trust, and in the reality that devotion does not always guarantee respect or reciprocity. Sleep came fitfully that night. The children dreamt peacefully, unaware of the storm lurking at the edges of their lives. I lay awake, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, contemplating the path forward. The first fracture had occurred, and the consequences were both immediate and far-reaching. Every plan, every expectation had been disrupted. The question was no longer if we would survive, but how, and whether the trust that had been broken could ever be rebuilt. Even as fear and sadness mingled, there was a small ember of determination. The loss of a home, though profound, did not erase the bonds that mattered most. The children remained, and with them, the responsibility and opportunity to rebuild, to reclaim a sense of security, and to adapt to circumstances that had been thrust upon us. The day's events were a stark reminder that life is unpredictable, often cruel, and yet within that unpredictability, resilience can emerge. By the time the night deepened, I felt the first stirrings of resolve. Grief and betrayal would not be the end. Lessons had been learned, wounds acknowledged, and a course forward began to form. Not easy, not certain, but necessary. The first fracture, though painful, became the catalyst for growth, understanding, and the slow, deliberate process of rebuilding a sense of safety and continuity for those who depended upon me. The weeks that followed the sale of the house were a blur of logistics, emotions, and careful planning. Every day demanded attention to the smallest details, yet even as I maintained order, a sense of impermanence lingered in every corner of our temporary apartment. Walls that had once offered comfort now seemed confining. Rooms that had felt ordinary before carried the weight of memories I could not revisit. Morning routines became a delicate dance of efficiency and reassurance. The children moved through their days with remarkable adaptability, though subtle signs betrayed the disorientation beneath the surface. Daniel, usually composed, exhibited moments of sudden impatience or frustration. Lucy sought comfort in drawing, creating worlds on paper where control and certainty existed. Thomas Jr., small and quiet, clung a little closer during mornings, seeking safety in proximity. Each behavior reminded me that stability is both fragile and essential, that children absorb far more than adults often recognize. Financial strain was relentless. Bills, rent, groceries, school supplies, every expense demanded careful calculation. I had once thought that hard work and careful planning could secure a life. That dedication alone could preserve the environment we had built. But the reality was stark. Life could be altered in a single stroke, and survival required constant vigilance. Nights were spent balancing accounts, tracking payments, and negotiating deadlines. I often sat at the kitchen table long after the children had gone to bed, surrounded by paperwork that seemed to multiply while the city outside carried on, indifferent to our struggles. Even amid these challenges, moments of joy persisted, delicate but sustaining. A drawing pinned to the refrigerator, a shared joke over breakfast, the sight of Daniel helping his younger siblings with homework. These instances offered proof that love and resilience endured, even when the material foundation of life had shifted. I clung to these fragments of normalcy, recognizing them as the threads that could mend the fabric of our disrupted existence. Visits to the neighborhood parks became rituals, not just for play but for grounding. Watching the children run and laugh, I felt an ache for what had been lost, yet I also felt pride in their ability to adapt. The world beyond our apartment offered both challenge and solace, a reminder that life continues, that the passage of time is inevitable, and that new memories can take root even in the shadow of loss. Sleep remained elusive, punctuated by the weight of reflection and worry. I often revisited decisions made, considering whether any action could have prevented the house from being sold. Questions lingered in quiet hours. Had there been subtle signs I missed? Could a conversation have altered the outcome? These thoughts were relentless, gnawing at peace of mind. Yet over time they gave way to a quieter awareness that some circumstances are beyond control, and that endurance requires acceptance as much as effort. The apartment itself became a space of negotiation and adaptation. Furniture arrangements were reconsidered to maximize comfort and functionality. Spaces for study, play, and quiet reflection were created intentionally. Small interventions meant to provide the children with a sense of stability. Each adjustment was both practical and symbolic, a declaration that despite upheaval, we could shape our environment to support resilience and growth. I also found solace in routines beyond the apartment. Grocery runs, library visits, and brief walks through familiar streets became grounding exercises. The city itself, with its familiar sounds and smells, provided continuity amid change. Observing life moving steadily around us, I was reminded that survival depends on participation in the rhythm of daily existence, even when the world seems indifferent to personal trials. Yet the emotional undercurrent remained potent. Feelings of loss, anger, and betrayal surfaced in unexpected moments. A misplaced document, a forgotten appointment, or even a fleeting memory could trigger intense waves of frustration or grief. I learned to navigate these emotions carefully, recognizing that unchecked reactions could disrupt the fragile equilibrium we were rebuilding. Mindfulness became an essential skill, observing emotions, understanding their source, and choosing responses that maintain stability without suppressing reality. The children's resilience was both inspiring and humbling. Daniel's growing maturity, Lucy's creativity, and Thomas Jr.'s gentle curiosity provided constant reminders that adaptability is possible, even in the face of significant disruption. Their behaviors were mirrors reflecting the effectiveness of guidance, patience, and emotional support. Observing them navigate challenges with courage encouraged me to persevere, to model strength even when uncertainty loomed. There were also moments of unexpected generosity and support. Neighbors offered assistance, small acts of kindness that alleviated some of the pressure. Friends called, sent messages, or checked in with practical advice. These gestures, though minor in the scale of material need, carried immense emotional weight. They reminded me that even amid hardship, connections, both old and new, serve as lifelines, reinforcing the network of care that sustains family. Despite the relentless pace, I took time to reflect, to process grief and disappointment. Journaling became a quiet companion, a space where fears, hopes, and lessons could be articulated without judgment. Writing allowed for acknowledgement of loss while simultaneously fostering clarity of thought, enabling decisions to be made with deliberation rather than impulse. It was a small but vital practice, providing a sense of agency in a world that had recently imposed chaos. Evenings were particularly tender times. The children, tired but content, would gather around for stories, music, or shared conversation. These moments, though simple, were profound reminders that the essence of home extends beyond walls and furniture. Home is connection, care, and the sense of safety that emerges from consistent attention. Through these shared evenings, we reaffirmed bonds, reinforced trust, and reclaimed a measure of stability within the altered landscape of our lives. Over time, subtle patterns emerged. The apartment ceased to feel entirely temporary, routines provided comfort, and small victories offered encouragement. The path forward was neither smooth nor predictable, yet each step reinforced the resilience that had begun to take root. Loss had been severe, trust fractured, and material stability disrupted, but the emotional core remained intact, a foundation upon which the future could be cautiously reconstructed. In these days of adjustment, a quiet understanding developed. Life's fragility is paired with its potential for renewal. Challenges, even those imposed unexpectedly, carry lessons that can strengthen resolve, deepen empathy, and illuminate priorities. Endurance is not passive. It requires conscious effort, awareness, and the willingness to confront both external pressures and internal fears. And through it all, the bond between family members becomes the anchor that sustains and guides, providing both reassurance and purpose. The weeks passed, blending into a rhythm that balanced obligation, care, and subtle recovery. While the memory of the house lingered, it no longer defined daily existence entirely. Adaptation became second nature, resilience a visible presence in our interactions. And though the weight of what had been lost remained, it was tempered by a growing awareness that survival, love, and continuity were possible, even in the aftermath of profound upheaval. It was an ordinary Tuesday when the first jolt arrived, subtle but undeniable. The children had gone off to school, leaving the apartment unusually quiet. The soft hum of city traffic outside barely audible. I had been tidying up the living room when a sound drifted through the air. A melody from the old radio I had left plugged in for background noise. At first, I barely registered it, absorbed in folding laundry, the mundane rhythm temporarily dulling my thoughts. Then it hit me, a song faint and distant, yet unmistakable. It was the song that had played at Daniel's 8th birthday, the one we had danced to in the living room, laughing as he twirled in his new shirt. The memory was instantaneous, vivid, and sharply painful. In a flash, the apartment around me seemed smaller, the walls closer, the silence heavier. The song carried more than nostalgia, it carried a reminder of everything that had been lost. The house, the sense of security, and the trust that had been broken when the home was sold without warning. I sank into the nearest chair, allowing the music to wash over me. Each note stirred a cascade of memories. I remembered decorating the living room for holidays, the children's wide-eyed excitement, the smell of baked apple pies filling the air. I remembered the quiet moments of reading together, the laughter that echoed through hallways, the way the house had seemed alive with connection and warmth. All of it now existed only in memory, haunting in its clarity and in its impossibility. The reminder was more than emotional, it was visceral. My chest tightened. The familiar ache of grief re-emerging with intensity. The loss of the house had been practical, financial, a matter of documents and signatures. But this small trigger revealed the emotional magnitude of what had been taken. It was one thing to endure disruption, to manage logistics, to explain circumstances to children. It was another to confront the depth of attachment to a place that had been the literal backdrop of life itself. I found myself wandering through the apartment, touching surfaces that once held memories of another time. The couch where Daniel had curled up with a book. The small kitchen table where Lucy had drawn countless pictures. The windowsill where Thomas Jr. had left tiny toys forgotten in the rush of play. Everything was ordinary in appearance, yet imbued with an intangible sense of absence. The contrast between the present and the past was jarring, each familiar object a reminder of what could no longer be reclaimed. Even mundane tasks became exercises in emotional endurance. Making breakfast, I found myself hesitating, the ritual of preparing food for the children now a reminder of routines interrupted. I glanced at the empty chairs, the spaces once filled with chatter and anticipation. I could almost hear echoes of voices, the unspoken history embedded in the everyday, a history that no longer had a physical home. The song played on, looping in my mind even after the radio had gone silent. I closed my eyes, allowing the memories to wash over me, both comforting and painful. There was a strange intimacy in this reflection, a recognition that the past remained a living part of consciousness even when circumstances had shifted irreversibly. I realized that grief is not linear. It does not dissipate entirely but resurfaces unpredictably, often triggered by the smallest of stimuli. A melody, a scent, a phrase that evokes a sense of what was once secure. In that quiet morning, I also recognized the necessity of processing these emotions. Suppression might offer temporary relief, but it did not heal the underlying wounds. I allowed myself to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge the ache without judgment, understanding that this awareness was a crucial step in reclaiming some measure of control over a disrupted life. Pain, I realized, could be both destructive and instructive, guiding decisions and shaping resilience. The children returned from school, bringing a burst of energy that punctured the intensity of introspection. Their laughter, their chatter, their simple questions about homework and snacks grounded me in the present. I was reminded that despite loss, life continued in tangible, demanding ways. The need to care for them, to respond to immediate concerns, offered structure and focus, a counterbalance to the waves of memory and grief that threatened to overwhelm. Yet the trigger had opened a door that could not be easily closed. Later that evening, I found myself going through old photo albums, scanning images of the house, of holidays, of birthdays long past. Each photograph told a story of connection, effort, and care, illuminating the deep personal investment that had made the sale of the house feel like a betrayal of both heart and history. The act of revisiting these memories was simultaneously comforting and painful, a reminder of what had been cherished and what could never be fully reclaimed. Even as sorrow surfaced, small sparks of determination emerged. I realized that acknowledgement of the past is necessary not only for mourning but also for moving forward. Memory is a teacher. It preserves lessons and illuminates priorities. I began to consider what it truly meant to rebuild, not merely in terms of material security, but in creating spaces of emotional safety, consistency, and belonging. These reflections, though born of grief, became a roadmap for resilience. I also became aware of the subtle ways in which the past influences the present. Actions taken now, decisions made in response to current challenges would be colored by memory and emotion. The children's sense of security, trust, and adaptability would be shaped by how these experiences were processed. It was a responsibility heavy with weight, yet empowering. Within it lay the ability to guide, nurture, and rebuild even when foundations had been shaken. By nightfall, a sense of balance returned, tentative but tangible. The trigger had unearthed grief, yet it had also reminded me of the strength that resides in acknowledgement and reflection. Memory, though painful, carries the power to inform and inspire, offering lessons that material loss alone cannot provide. I closed the photo albums with care, placing them where they could be revisited when needed, but no longer dominating the immediate space. The song lingered faintly in my mind, a companion to both sorrow and hope. In the stillness of that evening, a quiet understanding took root. Disruption is inevitable, grief is unavoidable, but resilience is a choice. It is cultivated in attention, awareness, and the deliberate act of moving forward despite discomfort. The small reminder, the melody from the past, had become a catalyst for reflection, grounding, and renewed intention. It had reignited not only memories, but also the recognition that life, even after profound upheaval, continues with possibility, connection, and the promise of recovery. The awakening didn't arrive like a storm, nor did it announce itself with clarity. It was subtle, a quiet stirring within the heart, an almost imperceptible shift in perspective. I noticed it first one late afternoon, when the apartment was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The children had gone off to a neighbor's for a brief playdate, leaving a rare stretch of solitude. I sat near the window, cup of tea in hand, listening to the distant hum of traffic, and suddenly realized that I had not felt completely consumed by grief in hours. I had been holding back for so long, tethered to a cycle of pain and recollection, that the mere absence of panic felt like a small miracle. It was in that stillness that I began to recognize the possibility of moving forward, not by erasing the past, but by confronting it intentionally. The awareness that I could engage with memories without being overwhelmed marked the beginning of a shift, a subtle but significant awakening. I found myself reaching for an old box tucked away in a closet, a container of letters, photographs, and keepsakes long left undisturbed. Each object felt weighty with significance, a physical manifestation of years of life, love, and investment. Picking up a photograph of the house, sunlight falling across its familiar facade, I paused. The image held both joy and sorrow, a reminder of stability lost and a life once nurtured. Yet instead of prompting despair, it prompted reflection. I began to see the story of the house not as a tragedy in isolation, but as a chapter in a larger narrative, one of resilience, growth, and endurance. I opened letters written years ago, some from friends, some from family members, and even a few from myself to myself, notes of encouragement, lists of hopes and intentions, reminders of the life I had intended to cultivate. As I read, I felt the weight of time, the accumulation of small victories, struggles, and choices. The letters were reminders that even in upheaval, life has continuity, and even in loss, there is evidence of persistence and care. In the days that followed, this awakening deepened. I began to walk through the neighborhood, not as a passive observer, but with a purpose, to reconnect with spaces that had shaped daily life and memories. The local park, once just a route for errands, became a place for quiet contemplation. The benches, the trees, the familiar path winding past the playground, all seemed imbued with stories, not just from the past, but from the possibilities of the present. I noticed details that had been invisible during moments of grief: the gentle sway of branches, the laughter of children from other families, the faint scent of flowers carried on the breeze. These walks became rituals of grounding. They allowed reflection without drowning in sorrow, creating space for insight and acceptance. I recognized that the awakening was not simply an emotional release. It was a reorientation of attention, a deliberate choice to engage with the present while acknowledging the past. Memory could inform, not imprison. Grief could guide, not dominate. The realization was empowering. I also began to reach out cautiously to old friends and family members. Calls that had once felt burdensome now became meaningful connections. Conversations, sometimes brief, sometimes long, reminded me that support exists beyond the confines of walls and possessions. Listening to familiar voices, sharing small updates, and receiving encouragement reasserted a sense of community, highlighting the importance of relationships that endure despite distance or material loss. The awakening carried into household routines as well. I reorganized living spaces with intention, creating small areas that encouraged comfort and reflection. A chair near the window became a reading nook. A corner table displayed photographs and mementos in a way that celebrated memory without overwhelming. Even the children noticed the subtle changes, responding with curiosity and a quiet approval that reinforced the idea that emotional stability can be cultivated through deliberate environmental choices. Beyond physical space, I began attending to the inner landscape. Journaling became a daily practice, a disciplined engagement with thought and feeling. I recorded memories, analyzed patterns, noted emotional triggers, and charted small victories in adaptation. These written reflections were a mirror, reflecting both the challenges of displacement and the emerging strength within. Each entry reinforced the awakening, the understanding that the past shapes us, but does not define the entirety of our present or future. A turning point occurred one evening while reviewing an old journal. I stumbled upon entries written shortly after the house was sold, passages heavy with despair and self-recrimination. Reading them now, I felt a mixture of compassion and resolve. Compassion for the fear and vulnerability I had experienced, and resolve to act differently, to integrate grief without allowing it to dictate actions, to honor the past without being shackled by it. The awakening was not sudden but cumulative, building in layers of recognition, reflection, and intentionality. The children's presence further cemented this process. Watching them adapt to new routines, celebrate small achievements, and navigate social interactions with grace reminded me that resilience is mirrored, taught, and reinforced. Each smile, each gesture of support, each spontaneous moment of laughter became evidence that life continues, that joy persists, and that the bonds of family remain a source of strength even when circumstances are turbulent. By the end of the week, the awakening had shifted from a subtle stir to an actionable clarity. I began making plans, not grandiose, not immediate, but practical and measured. Lists of priorities were created, strategies for emotional and logistical management outlined, and small goals set to restore a sense of agency. The act of planning, grounded in reflection rather than panic, was in itself a marker of progress. The most significant aspect of this awakening was a sense of empowerment. Loss and disruption had once rendered me passive, reactive, overwhelmed. Now, by engaging intentionally with memory, environment, and relationships, I discovered that agency remains even amid upheaval. The realization was both humbling and invigorating, a quiet assurance that the future could be navigated with thoughtfulness, resilience, and care. In these days of renewed awareness, I began to see the path forward more clearly. The house, though lost, could be honored through memory and ritual. Emotional stability, once fragile, could be nurtured through attention, reflection, and connection. And while the past would always echo, its resonance could serve as a guide rather than a chain. The awakening, subtle but profound, marked the threshold between reaction and deliberate living, a step toward reclaiming both peace and purpose. The search began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with small questions that stirred a need for answers. It was not a physical journey at first, but an internal one. I asked myself questions that had been buried under layers of shock and grief. Why had the house been sold without consultation? How could someone I had trusted implicitly make such a decision? What did this mean for the bonds between family members? These questions were heavy, persistent, and inescapable. The first step was reflection, revisiting past conversations, letters, and records that might hold clues. I spent evenings sifting through documents that had once seemed routine, bank statements, property papers, correspondence with realtors, and slowly patterns began to emerge. The sale had not been impulsive, it had been deliberate, orchestrated with an efficiency that suggested premeditation. That realization ignited a mixture of anger and clarity. It was not the chaos of circumstances, but the conscious choices of another that had upended our lives. Yet anger alone was insufficient. I needed context, perspective, and understanding. I began calling friends who had known the family intimately, people who might provide insight without bias. Some conversations were brief, others extended into hours, filled with recounting past interactions and family dynamics. Occasionally, there were revelations that contradicted my assumption, challenging my understanding of motives and intentions. Slowly, a mosaic of information assembled, each piece providing clarity and occasionally deepening the mystery. I also began speaking with professionals, financial advisors, legal consultants, counselors, to understand not only the practical consequences of the house sale, but also its emotional ramifications. These discussions grounded me, offering both guidance and perspective. It became clear that while the loss was significant, steps could be taken to mitigate further disruption. Knowledge, I realized, was a form of empowerment. By seeking it actively, I reclaimed a measure of agency that had been stripped away. The search extended beyond conversation and documentation. I revisited places that held significance in our family's history. The old library where Daniel had spent hours reading, the corner cafe where Lucy had celebrated her first A+ grade, the park where Thomas Jr. had learned to ride a bicycle. Each location offered fragments of memory and insight, subtle reminders of the life that had been cultivated over decades. The act of physically moving through these spaces created a sense of continuity, a bridge between what had been lost and what could be reclaimed emotionally. The search was not linear. Progress alternated with setbacks, moments of clarity interspersed with frustration and despair. Sometimes revisiting old haunts revealed the depth of absence, the realization that these places had changed, that people had moved on, and that the life once experienced there could not be restored. Yet even these revelations were instructive, teaching the importance of acceptance and the value of focusing on what could be influenced rather than what was irrevocably gone. A breakthrough came unexpectedly through a letter I had almost discarded. It was from Daniel, written months before the sale, full of reflections about family, growth, and his hopes for the future. Reading his words, I felt both sorrow and pride. Sorrow for the distance that had grown between us and pride in his insight and maturity. The letter prompted a decision to initiate direct dialogue with him, to ask questions and seek understanding not through assumption but through conversation. The first conversation was tentative, a careful navigation of words and emotions. There were pauses, hesitations, and moments where frustration threatened to dominate. Yet there was also honesty, empathy, and a willingness to listen. I discovered motives I had not considered, fears and pressures that had guided choices, and perspectives that offered insight without necessarily providing justification. This dialogue, though challenging, was essential. It revealed that understanding does not always equate to agreement, but it fosters clarity and the possibility of reconciliation. The process of searching also required introspection. I began journaling with renewed purpose, writing questions and attempting tentative answers. What had I overlooked? Where had I failed to communicate clearly? How had my own assumptions shaped expectations and reactions? This self-inquiry was not self-recrimination, rather. It was a disciplined exploration of responsibility, awareness, and growth. I realized that searching externally is incomplete without searching within, that closure is as much a product of personal reflection as it is of external revelation. At times, the search led to discomforting truths. Discovering financial mismanagement, overlooked legal obligations, or unspoken resentments required courage to confront. These moments were heavy. Yet each confrontation reinforced the necessity of facing reality rather than avoiding it. Understanding, even when painful, became a form of liberation, releasing assumptions, clarifying motives, and establishing a foundation for informed decisions moving forward. Community became a subtle ally in the search. Friends, neighbors, and colleagues offered observations, advice, and support, reminding me that perspective is often enhanced through dialogue with those removed from immediate circumstances. These interactions, small but meaningful, contributed to an expanding map of insight and understanding, a web of guidance that supported both emotional and practical navigation. The children's experiences also informed the search. observing how they processed the loss, adapted to routines, and expressed emotions offered critical clues about the effects of disruption and the importance of stability. Their resilience provided encouragement and a framework for evaluating the consequences of past decisions, guiding the search with both caution and compassion. By the end of this period of searching, a pattern emerged. Clarity is rarely immediate, understanding is iterative, and closure is often a journey rather than a destination. The act of searching, documenting, questioning, conversing, and reflecting provided a sense of control, a counterbalance to the chaos that had once felt overwhelming. The journey itself became a form of empowerment, reaffirming the capacity to respond thoughtfully to adversity. In these weeks of deliberate exploration, I realized that searching is not only about discovering answers, but also about cultivating awareness. It is about distinguishing between what can be influenced and what cannot, between intentions and outcomes, between perception and reality. Most importantly, it is about acknowledging the depth of feeling involved and honoring the personal and familial history that shapes every interaction. Through this process, a sense of agency began to return. Decisions could be made with knowledge rather than assumption, with empathy rather than frustration, and with the intention of fostering both understanding and emotional stability. The search, arduous though it was, marked a turning point, a movement from reactive endurance to intentional engagement, from confusion to clarity, from passive suffering to active navigation of life's complexities. The search would continue, perhaps indefinitely, as understanding and reconciliation are rarely absolute. Yet the very act of seeking, reflecting, and engaging had transformed the experience. Loss remained, disappointment lingered, and grief was never fully absent. But the path forward was illuminated by awareness, effort, and the conscious decision to confront both past and present with courage and care. It happened on a gray Thursday morning, the kind where the sky seems pressed low to the earth, heavy with unspoken weight. I had decided to sort through the attic, a space I had avoided for months. There had been a lingering hesitation, a quiet fear that opening boxes of old belongings might awaken grief I was not yet prepared to confront. Yet something within me, an insistent tug at the edges of consciousness, urged me to proceed. I wanted answers, clarity, and perhaps a piece of understanding that had eluded me during the weeks of reflection and searching. The attic was cold and musty, the air tinged with the scent of aged wood and fabric. Dust motes floated in the faint light streaming through a small circular window, catching on cobwebs and the edges of forgotten furniture. I moved slowly, mindful of the brittle floorboards beneath my feet, and began opening boxes labeled in my careful cursive script from years past. Each box carried fragments of life, photographs, old letters, children's school projects, and trinkets collected during vacations long since ended. As I lifted one box toward the center of the attic, something fell to the floor, a thin, unassuming envelope, yellowed with age and tucked beneath a stack of letters I had written to friends during the move. I picked it up carefully, noting the familiar handwriting. It was Daniel's, though it appeared older, written years before the house had been sold. The envelope bore no date, only his name in small, deliberate letters. With a sense of trepidation, I opened it. Inside were pages filled with his thoughts, reflections, and fears, written in the raw, unfiltered way that only a child on the cusp of adolescence can express. He spoke of family dynamics, of the pressures he felt from expectations, and most surprisingly of decisions he had witnessed or been aware of that I had never fully understood. The words were direct, earnest, and tinged with regret. He had observed conversations, documents, and decisions that hinted at the sale of the house before it occurred, yet had felt powerless to intervene. The discovery was a jolt, more profound than I anticipated. I had long assumed that the sale was a sudden unilateral act, a betrayal of trust executed without forewarning or internal conflict. Yet the letter revealed layers of complexity I had not seen. Daniel had been aware of certain financial pressures, of discussions held in hushed tones by adults, and of choices made out of concern, fear, and practicality rather than malice. While the outcome had still caused pain, the motive was no longer entirely opaque. It was not simple betrayal. It was a tangled weave of intention, misunderstanding, and circumstance. I read and reread the pages, absorbing the details that revealed both the depth of his awareness and the limitations imposed by youth. There were moments where I felt my anger ease slightly, replaced by a cautious empathy for a boy navigating responsibilities far beyond his years. The letter forced a reevaluation. the narrative I had carried for so long of deliberate harm and disregard was incomplete. There were nuances, subtleties, and unspoken pressures that had shaped the decisions, and recognizing them did not excuse the hurt, but it reframed it. Among the pages, I also found hints of Daniel's emotional turmoil. He had struggled with loyalty, caught between advocating for family cohesion and observing choices that conflicted with his sense of justice. He wrote of sleepless nights, internal debates, and small actions he had taken to mitigate harm where possible. These admissions were startling in their honesty, illuminating the inner life of a young mind trying to reconcile competing demands. The discovery did not instantly erase pain. It was impossible to undo the sense of displacement, the loss of a home, and the disruption to routines that had once been anchors. But it provided context, a lens through which to view events not as purely injurious, but as a sequence of choices constrained by circumstance, emotion, and human limitation. Context softened the edges of resentment, allowing understanding to emerge alongside grief. I took a moment to sit on the attic floor, letter in hand, letting the weight of realization settle. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, could now also be seen as a testament to effort, care, and complex decision-making. The sale was no longer merely a wound. It was part of a larger story in which everyone involved, myself included, had played a role shaped by knowledge, fear, hope, and constraint. The clarity was illuminating, not simple but powerful. The discovery prompted action. I wrote a response not to send immediately, but as a means of articulating understanding and processing emotion. I acknowledged the pain, the confusion, and the frustration, but also recognized Daniel's perspective, his limitations, and his attempts to navigate a difficult situation. Writing became a bridge between past and present, between grief and comprehension, a deliberate effort to align memory with insight rather than solely emotion. Beyond Daniel's letter, the attic contained other items that deepened this understanding. Receipts, notes, and correspondence between family members painted a fuller picture of decision-making processes, pressures, and rationales. Each artifact contributed to a tapestry of context, revealing that human intention is rarely simple, that actions are rarely unidimensional, and that perspective can dramatically alter interpretation. This revelation had emotional consequences. For the first time in months, I felt a cautious release from the suffocating grip of anger. Not a total forgiveness, not a complete absolution, but a measured acknowledgement that understanding is possible even when resolution remains incomplete. The discovery transformed the narrative from one of pure loss to a story that included complexity, awareness, and nuance. A story in which the past could coexist with clarity, if not closure. In the days that followed, I integrated these insights into daily life. Conversations with Daniel became informed by awareness of his earlier struggles. Interactions were tempered by empathy and recognition of context. The letter served as a touchstone, reminding me that perspective is vital, that human behavior is rarely black and white, and that understanding can coexist with emotional honesty. By the end of the week, a sense of equilibrium emerged. The discovery did not erase pain, but it reshaped its contours. Loss remained real, grief was still present, but clarity had emerged, allowing the past to inform the present with precision rather than distortion. The attic, once avoided, became a repository of insight, a space where memory, revelation, and reflection converged. In discovering what had been hidden, overlooked, or forgotten, I realized that life's truths are rarely absolute, that understanding often requires effort, curiosity, and courage. The act of uncovering, of piecing together fragments, was itself transformative. In that quiet attic, surrounded by dust, light, and memory, I recognized that discovery is not only about unearthing facts. It is about illuminating perspective, fostering empathy, and preparing for the next steps in a journey that, though marked by loss, is rich with possibility. The phone rang just as the late afternoon sun slanted through the living room windows, casting long golden streaks across the hardwood floors. I hesitated before picking it up, a subtle hesitation rooted not in fear but in anticipation. Something told me that this call, unlike the dozens I had made and received over the past weeks, carried weight and emotional gravity I could almost feel pressing through the receiver. "Hello," I said, voice steady, though my stomach churned with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Mom," the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Daniel." There was a slight tremor, an edge of vulnerability beneath his normally controlled tone. For a moment, silence fell, both of us hesitant to bridge the distance that months of miscommunication and misunderstanding had widened. I wanted to talk, he said finally, about everything. It was the moment I had both dreaded and longed for. The chance to confront the pain, to articulate feelings that had festered, and perhaps to hear truths unspoken. I nodded, though he could not see me, and felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease just slightly. We arranged to meet that evening at a small cafe midway between our homes, a neutral space, public enough to keep emotions contained, private enough for honesty. When I arrived, Daniel was already seated, hands folded, eyes cast downward. The cafe smelled faintly of coffee and pastries, a familiar, comforting scent that somehow grounded me. I sat across from him, noticing the subtle lines around his eyes, the faint worry in his expression, the way he seemed both younger and older at once, marked by choices, regret, and life itself. "Mom," he began, voice low, "I never meant for it to be like this. I didn't know how to stop things from happening, but I never wanted to hurt you." Hearing those words, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me, relief, sadness, and a hint of lingering anger. I took a deep breath, allowing myself to absorb them without immediate reaction. There was honesty there, raw and unpolished, the kind of admission that demands recognition. "I know," I replied softly. "I know you didn't act alone. I know there were pressures, decisions I might never fully understand, and moments where you felt trapped. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind of heavy, contemplative silence that fills the spaces between truth and reconciliation. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, the same yellowed letter I had found in the attic weeks ago. "I wrote this years ago," he said. "I never thought you'd find it. I guess I hoped it would help someday, but I didn't realize how much it could change things now." The sight of the envelope reignited memories of the attic, the discovery and the revelation that had reshaped my perspective. I looked at him, and for the first time in months I felt a bridge forming between us. A fragile, trembling connection built from acknowledgement, honesty, and willingness to confront pain directly. We began talking, cautiously at first, detailing what had happened, what had been hidden, and what we each had felt during the months of separation and confusion. The conversation was raw, unflinching. There were tears, moments of raised voices, and long pauses where the weight of emotions pressed down on both of us. Yet amid the tension, there was also understanding, the kind that emerges only when people commit to seeing one another honestly. He explained decisions I had never fully grasped, financial constraints, legal complications, and the pressures of adulthood he had been too young to fully manage. He spoke of guilt, of sleepless nights, of wishing he could have acted differently. His words were not excuses, they were context, offering a perspective that reframed the narrative I had carried for so long. "I acted out of fear," he admitted, eyes glistening. "Fear of failing, fear of losing control, fear of making the wrong choice for all of us. I didn't anticipate the pain it would cause you." Hearing this, I felt my anger dissipate, replaced by empathy. The truth was not simple. The sale of the house, the upheaval, and the sense of betrayal were real. But so too was the pressure and fear that had driven choices. Understanding emerged, delicate and complex, a lattice of compassion intertwined with residual grief. We also revisited past moments of misunderstanding, old arguments that had lingered unresolved, and long-held assumptions that had driven wedges between us. Speaking them aloud, acknowledging feelings without judgment, we began to untangle the knots that had constricted our relationship. Each admission, each confession was a small step toward reconciliation, a subtle release of tension built over years. By the end of the evening, we had not erased the past, nor had we solved every issue. But we had acknowledged each other's experiences, shared truths, and opened a path forward. The tension that had hung in the air for months lifted slightly, replaced by cautious hope. We left the cafe together, walking side by side, the silence between us now filled with possibility rather than uncertainty. Later, I reflected on the encounter. The confrontation had been transformative not because it solved everything, but because it demanded honesty, courage, and the willingness to face discomfort. It was a reminder that clarity and connection often emerge not from avoidance, but from the act of deliberate engagement with truth. That night, I felt a quiet exhaustion, the type that follows emotional exertion, but also a subtle exhilaration. The conversation had been raw, challenging, and even painful at moments, yet it had illuminated a path forward, a bridge from grief to understanding. It reminded me that relationships, even strained ones, can evolve when honesty and empathy guide interaction. As I prepared for bed, I thought of the house, of the attic, of the letter, and of Daniel's presence that evening. The story of loss, discovery, and confrontation had reached an emotional apex, not with resolution of every question, but with the acknowledgement of truth, accountability, and the tentative reclamation of connection. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, I felt the stirring of peace, a sense that while life is unpredictable and relationships complex, the capacity for understanding, forgiveness, and emotional renewal persists. The climax of this journey was not marked by triumph alone, but by the courage to face pain, the willingness to embrace complexity, and the choice to continue moving forward with honesty and intention. In the embrace of confrontation and revelation, I had found not just answers, but a renewed sense of agency, a belief that even after disruption and loss, clarity, connection, and hope can be reclaimed. The days following that conversation with Daniel felt like emerging from a dense fog. The house, quiet and still, seemed to breathe differently, as if the air itself carried the residue of our discussion. I noticed small shifts, the way light fell across the living room in the morning, the subtle echo of footsteps in empty hallways, the gentle hum of distant traffic. These ordinary sounds, once background noise, now seemed amplified, resonating with the quiet clarity that had followed our confrontation. Emotionally, the aftermath was a strange combination of relief and exhaustion. Relief because the conversation had allowed truths to be spoken, emotions to be acknowledged, and misunderstandings to be partially untangled. Exhaustion because honesty, once unburdened, leaves its own weight. A mixture of vulnerability, recognition, and acceptance that is far more demanding than silence. I found myself reflecting constantly, replaying phrases, gestures, and expressions from that meeting, analyzing tone and nuance as though trying to extract every possible insight. Sleep for a few nights came unevenly. Dreams were vivid, populated by fragments of conversation, letters, and familiar rooms from the past. I would wake suddenly, heart racing, only to realize that the fear, anger, and grief that had haunted me for months were gradually giving way to something more nuanced. There was pain still, yes, but also a subtle understanding that the path forward was not dictated solely by events or decisions, but by perspective, intention, and active engagement. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, began to feel differently. Each room, each object, seemed imbued with layers of memory I had overlooked. A chair in the corner, worn and familiar, carried traces of conversations, laughter, and even arguments that now felt less like wounds and more like markers of life lived fully. I began tidying, sorting, and even redecorating small corners, not to erase history but to honor it, acknowledging the past while making room for presence and future experiences. Interactions with Daniel became part of this integration. We spoke more frequently, cautiously at first. Each conversation a balance between acknowledgement of past pain and shared intention for clarity. There were still difficult moments when old anger surged unexpectedly or when frustration flared over lingering misunderstandings. Yet these moments were shorter, less consuming, tempered by the foundation of honesty and mutual awareness we had built. Emotional resilience was forming quietly but steadily, through repeated practice of openness and listening. I also sought support in unexpected places. Friends who had known me for decades provided counsel and perspective, not by offering solutions, but by reminding me of my capacity to process, adapt, and continue living fully. Conversations over tea or during long walks were therapeutic in ways I had not anticipated. Their presence and reassurance served as reminders that life, even when disrupted, is rich with potential for growth and renewal. Reflecting further, I recognized patterns in my emotional response. I realized that much of the grief and anger had stemmed from assumptions I had made, interpretations of intent that were not entirely accurate, and a lack of communication that had widened the gap between understanding and reality. Acknowledging this was neither self-blame nor denial, it was clarity. I understood that moving forward required both awareness and active choice, choosing empathy without erasing hurt, choosing dialogue without avoiding conflict, choosing presence without negating memory. The attic, revisited after the conversation with Daniel, became a sanctuary of understanding. I organized letters, documents, and photographs with intent, creating a space that reflected not only history but insight. Each item, once a simple artifact, now carried context, lessons, and subtle truths about family dynamics, decision-making, and the limits of human perspective. Sorting through these objects became both literal and metaphorical work, untangling past events, assigning meaning, and making peace with ambiguity. Financial and logistical matters, long sources of tension, were addressed with a newfound clarity. Decisions about the sale of the house, inherited responsibilities, and future plans were approached with practical precision, informed by understanding rather than reactive emotion. I realized that the confrontation had provided a form of empowerment, a lens through which to assess both risks and opportunities without being entirely driven by residual anger. Decisions could now be made with deliberation, informed insight, and emotional equilibrium. Socially, I felt a subtle reorientation. Relationships that had been strained by misunderstanding were now navigable. Neighbors, distant family members, and friends responded to my calm, informed presence with renewed respect and engagement. I noticed that clarity in communication fosters clarity in response. By approaching interactions grounded in honesty and composure, the external world mirrored the internal work I was undertaking. Amid these developments, grief remained. It never fully disappeared, and it likely never would. The house had been a home, a repository of memories, and a site of emotional upheaval. Its loss was tangible. Yet the grief had shifted from raw, consuming pain to a reflective, informed awareness. It no longer dictated every thought or reaction but served as a companion, a reminder of what had been and of the capacity to navigate life with understanding and grace. Through this period of aftermath, I also reflected on the lessons for future generations. I considered how Daniel had grown through these challenges, how my own responses had shaped the emotional landscape of our family, and how understanding and communication could prevent the repetition of similar missteps. There was a pedagogical element to this aftermath, a recognition that lived experience can be transformed into guidance, empathy, and subtle teaching for those who follow. By the end of the weeks that followed, I felt an integration of past and present. Anger, grief, and fear coexisted with understanding, empathy, and cautious optimism. I was not untouched, nor had I achieved complete resolution, but a sense of equilibrium had emerged. The confrontation, combined with reflection, dialogue, and practical action, had created a foundation on which future emotional stability and relational clarity could be built. In the quiet of early mornings, as sunlight filtered through curtains and birds stirred outside, I often sat in the living room, a cup of tea in hand, letting the calm settle. It was in these moments that I recognized the subtle transformation. The aftermath was not an ending but a transition, a passage from raw emotion to informed presence, from reaction to deliberation, from disconnection to cautious, intentional engagement. This integration marked a turning point. The recognition that life continues, that pain coexists with understanding, and that emotional resilience is cultivated through action, reflection, and communication. The confrontation had been a catalyst, but the aftermath was where the real work occurred, the day-to-day application of insight, empathy, and awareness that allowed both self and family to move forward with clarity and grace. Weeks turned into months, and life began to unfold in its quiet, persistent rhythm. The turbulence of anger, betrayal, and confusion that had once consumed me had gradually given way to a measured sense of clarity. I realized that closure does not arrive suddenly, nor is it a singular moment. It is cumulative, a series of small, intentional acts, reflections, and reconciliations that gradually settle the heart. One morning, I found myself walking along the familiar path that led to the neighborhood park. The sun filtered through golden autumn leaves, casting shadows that danced across the pavement. The crisp air carried the faint scent of wood smoke from chimneys, a reminder of warmth within homes where lives continued despite pain. As I walked, I reflected on the changes that had taken place, not only within my family but within myself. Closure, I recognized, is not about forgetting or dismissing the hurt. It is about understanding its place in the story, acknowledging it, and letting it exist without dictating every decision or emotion. I had spent weeks writing letters I would never send, speaking truths into empty rooms, and meditating on the events that had fractured my sense of stability. These acts, though solitary, were profound in their effect. They allowed the past to inform the present without imprisoning it. Daniel and I continued our conversations, evolving from tentative exchanges to open, honest dialogue. There were moments of laughter, reminiscent of years before the tension had begun, and moments of quiet contemplation where words were unnecessary and understanding was communicated through presence alone. These interactions were delicate and measured, yet they carried a weight of significance far greater than any overt gesture could express. I also began reconnecting with my own sense of identity, separate from the house, the sale, or the turbulence surrounding family decisions. For so long, my life had been defined by place, circumstance, and the choices of others. Now I took small steps to reclaim autonomy, arranging my living space in ways that reflected my taste and comfort, engaging in hobbies long neglected, and tending to friendships that had been sidelined by grief. These acts were subtle yet powerful. They represented a conscious reclaiming of agency and joy in the wake of disruption. One particularly poignant afternoon, I revisited the attic. The boxes, once overwhelming in their volume and the emotions they contained, now seemed manageable. I carefully sorted the remaining letters and mementos, storing some, discarding others, and creating a catalog of memory that honored both the past and the present. In doing so, I realized that letting go is not synonymous with erasing. It is a process of honoring memory without allowing it to anchor the heart in pain. It was during one of these reflective moments that I encountered a small photograph tucked behind a stack of letters. It depicted Daniel and me on a summer afternoon, years before the sale of the house, both of us laughing with unrestrained joy. The image struck me with both nostalgia and tenderness, a reminder that connection once fractured can still exist, and that love, though tested, does not necessarily vanish. Closure also demanded forgiveness, not in the sense of excusing actions, but in releasing the corrosive grip of resentment. I realized that holding on to anger, though justified in some ways, prevented me from experiencing peace. Forgiveness became an intentional act, a recognition of human fallibility, a willingness to see Daniel as both capable and flawed, and a choice to move forward without carrying unnecessary burdens. In practical terms, this period also involved reevaluating relationships and responsibilities. Decisions regarding finances, the remnants of the house, and familial obligations were approached with a calm, measured perspective. Past disputes that had seemed monumental were reframed in light of understanding, and the path forward became a series of intentional choices rather than reactive responses. Emotionally, the experience transformed me. I became attuned to subtle nuances in behavior, more patient with the limitations of others, and more forgiving of my own imperfections. The confrontation and aftermath had taught me that life is rarely simple, that people act within constraints both visible and hidden, and that clarity often emerges not from anger but from understanding and dialogue. During this period, I also nurtured a practice of writing reflections each morning. These were not letters intended for anyone but myself, nor were they accounts of events intended to capture exact detail. Instead, they were meditations, observations of emotion, realizations about relationships, and contemplations on what it meant to live with integrity, empathy, and awareness. Over time, these reflections became a repository of insight, helping me navigate daily life with balance and perspective. A defining moment came one evening as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and violet. Daniel called, his voice warm and calm. We spoke of the past, acknowledged the lingering challenges, and for the first time in months, discussed future possibilities without fear or anger. The conversation was not revolutionary, but it was restorative, a testament to the slow, deliberate work of closure. I realized then that closure is not a destination. It is a practice, an ongoing engagement with memory, emotion, and understanding. It is both internal and relational, a process that requires patience, reflection, and courage. The sale of the house, once a source of devastation, had become a catalyst for growth, understanding, and emotional maturation. The experience had illuminated the importance of perspective, the necessity of dialogue, and the capacity for resilience in the face of disruption. By the end of this period, I felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that while life remains unpredictable, relationships remain complex, and challenges will inevitably arise, I possess the tools to navigate them with grace, insight, and empathy. The house had been lost, but something more valuable had been reclaimed: A sense of agency, a capacity for understanding, and the foundation for meaningful connection moving forward. In those quiet evenings, I would often sit by the window, reflecting on the past, appreciating the present, and anticipating the future. The journey from betrayal and confusion to closure and understanding had been neither swift nor easy, but it was real, profound, and deeply transformative. And in that quiet reflection, I recognized the truth. Closure is less about erasing the past and more about embracing life fully, with awareness, compassion, and resilience. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves from the night's rain. Margaret stepped onto the front porch, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The house was quiet, the only sound the distant rustle of trees swaying in a gentle breeze. For a long moment she simply stood there, letting the cool air wash over her, feeling a profound sense of calm that had been elusive for months. The silence itself seemed alive, offering an opportunity to breathe, to reflect, and to absorb the subtle changes that had taken place within her. Sitting in her old rocking chair, she let herself sway slowly, each motion measured, deliberate, and comforting. The chair creaked softly, a familiar companion that had borne witness to decades of life's joys and sorrows. Margaret's gaze drifted across the yard, the faded blooms of summer, the scattering of fallen leaves, the swing set rusting quietly in the corner. Each element told a story, a memory, a trace of life's passage. And yet, instead of grief, she felt a quiet appreciation, the recognition that life had continued, resilient and persistent despite the upheaval she had experienced. In her hand, she held a photograph of her family from years ago. It was slightly frayed at the edges, the colors softened by time, but the smiles and warmth in the image were unmistakable. Her children were younger, carefree, full of laughter, and she saw in them the echoes of her own youth. She allowed herself to linger on the image, recalling moments long past, birthday celebrations, summer picnics, quiet evenings spent reading together. These memories were bittersweet, tinged with longing, yet they were also comforting. They reminded her of love's enduring presence, even when life's circumstances had been turbulent. Margaret picked up a pen and notebook from the small table beside her chair. She wrote slowly, carefully, letting her thoughts flow onto the page without restraint or judgment. Words spilled in a mixture of gratitude, reflection, and quiet introspection. She wrote about the confrontation with Daniel, about the aftermath, about the gradual journey toward understanding and closure. Each word seemed to release a weight she had carried for too long, a gentle unburdening of heart and mind. The act of writing became a ritual, a way to give shape to feelings that often seemed elusive or overwhelming. Margaret wrote of small victories, the calm she felt walking through her home, the joy of reconnecting with old friends, the subtle pride in her ability to navigate difficult conversations without succumbing to anger. She also acknowledged moments of lingering sorrow, the house that was gone, the mistakes that could not be undone, the words left unsaid. Yet she wrote these truths without judgment, accepting both light and shadow as integral parts of her journey. Outside, the world carried on, neighbors tending to gardens, children laughing in the distance, birds hopping along the fence. Margaret felt connected to this life, part of its ebb and flow, and simultaneously aware of the inner life that had shifted so profoundly. She realized that peace was not a destination but a state of awareness, a choice to engage fully with the present moment while honoring the past. The contrast between external activity and internal reflection was a delicate balance, but one that brought a sense of grounding she had not felt in years. In the quiet, Margaret began to notice subtle details she had overlooked before. The way sunlight caught the edges of the porch railing, the sound of distant wind chimes, the soft rustle of a bird's wings against the morning sky. These moments were small, seemingly inconsequential, yet they carried significance, reminders that beauty, serenity, and presence exist even amid life's chaos. She breathed deeply, letting the rhythms of her surroundings sync with her own heartbeat, and felt a rare alignment between inner and outer worlds. Her thoughts drifted again to Daniel, and she smiled softly. Their conversations had evolved into something nuanced, a blend of candor, empathy, and patience. While the past could not be erased, a new form of connection had emerged, a relationship not defined by resentment or expectation, but by honest engagement and mutual respect. This realization brought comfort, a quiet assurance that healing is rarely linear but is always possible through effort, reflection, and willingness to see the humanity in others. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the cadence of life around her. She acknowledged her own resilience, the endurance required to face betrayal, the courage to confront painful truths, the capacity to forgive without condoning. Each breath seemed to carry a sense of liberation, An acknowledgement that while she could not control the past, she could choose how to inhabit the present. The house, the sale, the disputes, they remained parts of her story, but they no longer defined the entirety of her existence. As the day unfolded, she took a slow walk through her garden, noticing the emerging colors of late-season blooms, the texture of the soil beneath her hands, the quiet persistence of nature itself. It struck her that life, like her garden, requires attention, care, and patience. Growth does not occur instantly. It unfolds gradually, shaped by seasons of sun and rain, of hardship and renewal. This metaphor mirrored her own journey, a recognition that healing, understanding, and clarity develop over time, nurtured by awareness and intention. Later, back in her rocking chair, Margaret sipped a cup of tea, feeling the warmth seep through her hands and into her chest. She allowed herself a moment of gratitude for resilience, for family, for lessons learned, and for the quiet beauty of the present. The photograph still rested on the table beside her, a gentle reminder of the enduring bonds that persist through change and adversity. She touched its edges lightly, acknowledging memory without clinging, honoring experience without letting it weigh down her spirit. As evening approached, the sky painted with soft hues of purple and gold. Margaret felt a sense of completion, a pause in the ongoing rhythm of life that allowed her to reflect, absorb, and simply be. The moment was not monumental, nor was it marked by overt triumph. Yet in its simplicity lay profound significance, a recognition that peace, presence, and understanding are cultivated gradually, through reflection, attention, and a willingness to witness one's own life with honesty and grace. In that quiet moment, on a porch bathed in soft evening light, Margaret experienced a subtle, enduring clarity. She understood that life's trials, though challenging, offer opportunities for insight, growth, and connection. She embraced both the fragility and resilience of human experience, finding solace in the ordinary, beauty in reflection, and meaning in continued engagement with life's unfolding narrative. The late afternoon sun filtered through the living room window, casting long golden beams across the hardwood floor. Margaret sat quietly, a cup of tea warming her hands, and watched the dust particles drift lazily through the light. For the first time in months, there was no urgent tension in her chest, no lingering resentment, no restless thoughts demanding answers. There was only presence, a gentle awareness of her own breath, the rhythm of life around her, and the knowledge that she had endured, learned, and evolved. It was remarkable how swiftly perspective could transform pain into insight. The sale of the house, once a source of heartbreak, had become an unlikely catalyst for personal growth. It forced her to confront truths she had long avoided, to engage with family in ways that were honest yet vulnerable, and to recognize her own strength in navigating challenges that would have once left her paralyzed by fear or anger. Life, Margaret reflected, rarely follows a predictable trajectory, but in that unpredictability lies opportunity for resilience, understanding, and transformation. Margaret thought about the weeks and months that had led to this moment. She remembered the initial shock of betrayal, the raw surge of grief and anger, and the long, exhausting nights filled with reflection and uncertainty. She had questioned herself repeatedly. Had she done enough? Could she have acted differently? Was there still a chance for reconciliation, or was the fracture permanent? Each question, once a source of torment, had gradually become a lens through which to examine not only the situation, but her own values, intentions, and capacity for empathy. The calm in her chest was not an absence of emotion, it was the integration of it. Pain and love, regret and forgiveness, loss and gratitude all existed simultaneously, each informing the other. She understood now that closure is not a singular achievement, nor is it defined by external circumstances. It is cultivated internally, through reflection, acceptance, and deliberate engagement with life as it is, rather than as one wishes it might have been. Daniel had called earlier that day. Their conversation had been brief, yet meaningful, a simple exchange of words that carried more weight than any grand gesture could. There was acknowledgement of past mistakes, recognition of each other's intentions, and the mutual understanding that, though life would never be free of complexity, they were willing to navigate it with honesty, patience, and respect. Margaret felt a quiet gratitude for this connection, realizing that reconciliation does not erase the past, but it allows relationships to exist in a space defined by possibility rather than resentment. She reflected on the tangible changes in her life since the confrontation and aftermath. The home, though smaller and simpler than the one she had lost, felt full of potential. Rooms were organized to her liking, spaces were imbued with personal touches, and every corner carried a subtle reminder of resilience. Daily routines, once burdensome, now comforting, offered rhythm and stability. Meals shared with friends, walks through familiar neighborhoods, and quiet mornings spent in reflection became small rituals of grounding and nourishment. Each action, however ordinary, was a testament to the deliberate cultivation of presence and peace. Margaret allowed herself to revisit memories of her family, not with longing or bitterness, but with a nuanced appreciation of their complexity. The challenges she had faced were part of a larger narrative, one in which each character, herself included, was imperfect, learning and growing. She could acknowledge mistakes without being consumed by them, recognize hurt without allowing it to dominate her sense of self, and embrace love without being naive about its fragility. This equilibrium, she realized, was a form of empowerment, a reclamation of life from chaos, a conscious choice to inhabit her story with awareness and grace. In the quiet, she noticed small joys she had previously overlooked. The warmth of sunlight on her hands, the subtle fragrance of fresh-baked bread from a neighbor's kitchen, the gentle hum of distant traffic, all were simple reminders of continuity, comfort, and the beauty of the ordinary. Margaret understood that life's richness often lies not in grand gestures, but in these subtle, fleeting moments that, when observed with intention, carry profound meaning. As evening approached, the sky blushed with soft shades of pink and purple. Margaret moved to the porch, rocking gently as she had many times before. The rhythmic motion of the chair, the gentle sway of leaves in the breeze, and the quiet hum of life beyond her home combined to create a moment of serene reflection. She allowed herself to feel the fullness of her journey, the weight of challenges faced, the depth of lessons learned, and the subtle joy of arriving at a place of balance. In her mind, she traced the timeline of events that had brought her here. From the shock of betrayal to the confrontation, the arduous aftermath, and the painstaking work of reflection and dialogue, every moment had contributed to the person she had become. She understood that suffering and joy, loss and recovery, anger and forgiveness are not mutually exclusive. Rather, they coexist, informing each other and providing texture to the human experience. Margaret had come to accept this complexity, finding comfort in its honesty. The evening deepened, stars beginning to glimmer faintly overhead. Margaret sipped her tea slowly, savoring both its warmth and the quiet intimacy of the moment. She felt an unexpected lightness, as if the burdens that had weighed so heavily upon her shoulders had been transformed into lessons, memories, and a renewed sense of agency. Life, she realized, was not about erasing pain or seeking perfection. It was about embracing the totality of experience, engaging fully with the present, and cultivating compassion for oneself, for others, and for the unfolding narrative of existence. In that tranquil hour, Margaret allowed herself to dream, not of what had been lost, nor of what might have been, but of possibilities, gentle, deliberate, and deeply grounded in the understanding she had cultivated. She envisioned days marked by curiosity, connection, and presence. She imagined conversations with family that were patient and honest, friendships nurtured with care, and moments of solitude cherished for their clarity and restorative power. This vision, fragile yet promising, offered a sense of hope that was steady and enduring. As night fell, Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool air brush her cheeks. She felt gratitude for her journey, for the courage it had required, and for the clarity it had yielded. The house had been sold, conflicts had been confronted, and misunderstandings had been addressed. Yet the true gift was the transformation within, the ability to inhabit life with wisdom, calm, and a renewed appreciation for both the ordinary and extraordinary moments that define existence. And so, as the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, she remained on the porch, rocking gently, fully present, and quietly celebrating the resilience, insight, and understanding she had cultivated. The world beyond her home continued in its steady rhythm, and she felt fully aligned with it, aware, grateful, and profoundly alive. Night had fully settled over the town, a deep velvet sky sprinkled with stars. Margaret sat by her window, the soft glow of a lamp illuminating her face as she cradled a warm cup of tea in her hands. Outside, the world was quiet but alive, the faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the soft hoot of an owl carried through the stillness. In this tranquility, she felt a sense of completeness, a culmination of months of turmoil, reflection, and healing. The journey she had undertaken was not linear. It had been a series of storms and lulls, moments of confrontation and reflection, sorrow and subtle joy. The sale of the house had been the spark, an event that forced truths to surface and emotions to be examined. The betrayal she felt when her son had made the decision without consulting her had been profound, shaking her to the core. But in that upheaval, she discovered resilience she hadn't known she possessed, an understanding of her own capacity to adapt, forgive, and embrace life fully. Margaret reflected on the people who had touched her life during this time. Daniel, her son, had evolved from a source of tension to a companion in dialogue, offering moments of clarity, humility, and reconciliation. Friends and neighbors, often unnoticed in the background, had become a quiet support network, their presence a reminder that community can hold one steady when life's tides are unpredictable. She also thought about herself, her choices, her reactions, and the courage it had taken to confront uncomfortable truths. It was here, in the recognition of her own strength, that she felt the deepest sense of empowerment. In the stillness, she allowed herself to revisit the pain she had endured without resistance. She remembered the shock, the anger, the nights spent pacing her empty home, the relentless questioning of her own decisions. Rather than suppressing these memories, she let them surface fully, acknowledging their existence and the lessons they carried. Pain, she realized, is a teacher in disguise. It demands attention, reflection, and adaptation, but it also fosters growth, empathy, and a renewed appreciation for life's complexities. Her gaze fell on a photograph on the mantel, a family portrait taken long before the house had been sold, capturing laughter, connection, and a sense of togetherness that had once felt unshakable. Margaret smiled softly. Memories do not vanish. They linger not to torment, but to remind us of love's endurance, of bonds that persist despite misunderstandings, distance, or mistakes. She felt a quiet gratitude for these memories, holding them lightly without attachment or regret. Margaret's thoughts wandered to the concept of family itself. She had learned that family is not merely defined by proximity, shared property, or rigid roles. It is a living, evolving network of connection, empathy, and shared history. Conflicts, betrayals, and disappointments are inevitable, yet they do not erase the potential for understanding, reconciliation, or renewed affection. In recognizing this, she embraced a sense of flexibility, patience, and compassion that reshaped her approach to relationships. The night was deepening, and Margaret took a slow, reflective walk through her garden. The scent of late-season blooms mingled with the crispness of autumn air, the faint glow of the moon illuminating the path. Each step reminded her of small, essential truths. Life is fragile yet resilient, love is complex but enduring, and peace is cultivated, not given. She had spent months navigating emotional upheaval, confronting family dynamics, and exploring her own responses to adversity. Now, in this quiet walk, she could feel the culmination of those efforts, a balance between acceptance, insight, and renewed hope. Returning indoors, she settled in her favorite chair, pulling a blanket across her lap. She reflected on the lessons she wanted to carry forward. Patience, understanding, and empathy were among them. The ability to forgive both herself and others had become essential. She recognized the value of presence, being fully engaged with life as it unfolds, without clinging to past mistakes or anxieties about the future. And above all, she understood that resilience is a living practice, nourished by reflection, intention, and self-compassion. Margaret's mind also wandered to the idea of legacy. Beyond material possessions, beyond houses, and beyond conflicts, what remained was the imprint of her character, her responses, and her capacity to cultivate love, wisdom, and understanding. The sale of the house, while once a devastating blow, had become a metaphor for impermanence and adaptability. Loss, she realized, is not always an ending. It can be an invitation to reshape, reimagine, and reclaim one's life in meaningful ways. As she sat quietly, she recalled a phrase that had guided her through the darkest moments. "This too shall pass." It was not a simple reassurance. It was a truth embedded in the natural rhythms of life. Pain passes. Clarity emerges. Relationships evolve. And the heart, even when fractured, continues to expand in capacity. Margaret had lived this truth fully, experiencing both its challenges and its rewards. She glanced one last time at the quiet street beyond her window, the dim glow of porch lights flickering in the distance. She felt a sense of peace that was neither fleeting nor superficial. It was a deep, enduring calm born from the understanding that life is complex. Love is imperfect, and human connections require both courage and humility. In accepting this, she had found freedom from lingering resentment, clarity from confusion, and hope from despair. Margaret leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, savoring the final stillness of the evening. She understood that life would continue to present challenges, unexpected twists, and moments of both sorrow and joy. Yet she was prepared, strengthened by the journey she had undertaken. She had learned to navigate uncertainty with grace, to engage with others authentically, and to honor her own capacity for resilience. In the quiet of that night, Margaret felt an encompassing gratitude for her life, her experiences, her family, and the lessons woven through both joy and adversity. She recognized the universal truth she had discovered, that family, love, and understanding are ongoing practices, shaped by patience, reflection, and the willingness to see humanity in oneself and others. Life is neither perfect nor predictable, but it is profoundly meaningful when approached with intention, compassion, and openness. And so, as the stars glimmered faintly above, she allowed herself a final deep breath, a silent acknowledgement of the journey behind her, the life unfolding before her, and the wisdom carried within. Margaret felt whole, not because life had been flawless, but because she had embraced it fully, with courage, love, and an unwavering awareness of what truly matters. In that moment, she understood that peace is not a destination. It is the art of living, moment by moment, with grace, clarity, and an open heart. And as the night settled, I realized that peace isn't found in perfect circumstances. It's found in understanding and letting go, and in embracing the lessons life has given you. I may have lost a house, I may have been hurt, but I've gained clarity, resilience, and a deeper connection to the people and moments that truly matter. This is a reminder that family is never perfect, but love, forgiveness, and hope can be nurtured every single day. If Margaret's story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more a true story about this grandma and other heartfelt real-life stories. Thank you for watching, and may your own journeys bring you strength, compassion, and hope.